Hello, this is Dr. Aldwin Ragunan continuing on my lectures on Pentecostal preaching. This morning we are going to be talking about the various types of preaching. First we tried to speak about expository preaching as one of the primary types of preaching that Pentecostal does. Also, expository preaching is the dominant form of preaching today. As we look at the types of sermon, we are moving from expository type to topically oriented type. Let me pinpoint two things before I start this lecture. One is the types of sermon that people or homiletics or scholars the label is very liquid. By that I mean it one type to the other is very similar. And so I would suggest that do not be confined to the limitations a author, a particular teacher might put on you. I would expand further and forget the labels. But the second and most important thing that you want to do is you want to make your sermon Christocentric. So whatever sermon you preach, whatever type you preach, whether you start from a scripture or you intertwine scripture, your sermon should be Christocentric. It should point to Jesus. And if you have failed to point to Jesus, you are failing to preach what I believe to be the most important ingredient in preaching. So now I want to move to topically oriented sermons. And among topically oriented sermons, it could be expository, it could be textual, and it could be topical. The old labels that have been used. The important thing is that equal emphasis should be given to the scripture and the application to the audience. That is what we will call topically oriented sermons. So I hope I don't confuse you. I have nothing with problems with expository, topical, textual. These things are good. And if you prefer to use those terms in understanding your preaching, so be it. But the distinction I want to make here is that topically oriented sermons are sermons that emphasize the scripture and the application to the audience. And as I was saying in the last lecture, textual sermon does not only have to be from a verse or 5 verses, but it could be a subject if all the major points is supported by a scripture, and it could be outside a particular passage of scripture. So, example, I was giving you an example of heaven, and I took my scripture from, this is a subject, from Revelation 21, 1 to 5, and Revelation 22, 1 to 5. And my first point was, and heaven is the place of peace, Revelation 21, verses 4 and 5. My second point is, heaven is a place of happiness, Revelation 21, 6. Thirdly, heaven is a place of reconciliation, 21, 3. And then I jump out of Revelation, and I think I am correct in that I am speaking about a subject. I say heaven is a place of full knowledge. We are limited now, and that scripture comes from 1 Corinthians 13, 12. And then I go back to my final point, that heaven is a place of worship, Revelation 22, 3, and 19, 1 through 7, and 7, Revelation 7, 9 through 12. And what I have done here is I'm speaking about a subject, but the subject is wide, but it is an expository sermon in that it is a subject also. But the subject needs more material, and it is expository in that I do the research for each major point, the textual and the critical research, the exegesis, the understanding of that portion of scripture. So in my mind, it appears to me that this is a topically oriented sermon. It also is a expository sermon, as I was saying. Now, it also can be a topical sermon. The difference between a textual and expository sermon, between the topical and expository and textual sermon, is usually it is supposed to have a scripture for each major point. However, I do not think that it is necessarily should have a scripture for each major point. And the way we get an example of this type of preaching is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount on Matthew 5 through 7, I think it is. And he deals with various subjects of worry and joy and love and things of that sort. Now, let me repeat again. A topical sermon you can intertwine scripture. It doesn't have to have a scripture that you preach from, but you can intertwine scripture. And you remember the term I'm using here is topically oriented, so don't get confused about that. All I'm saying is a topically oriented sermon is able to take the scripture and apply it to the audience, so there's equal emphasis. Now, I have a sermon here that I would like to bring to your attention. It is, Jesus is like light. my scripture is John 8:12, where it says Jesus is the light of the world. And this sermon has only one scripture, and I show how Jesus is like light. First of all, I said Jesus is like light in that he brings men to safety. And the safety is in Jesus himself. The second point is Jesus is like light in that he dispels darkness. Whenever Jesus comes into community or home or life, that darkness of sin is dispelled. Then, thirdly, I said that Jesus is like light in that he normalizes the surroundings. I believe without Jesus, people are not normal. And there are so much problems today. And so with Jesus in our lives, he normalizes our surrounding in that our home and our lives are filled with joy and peace. And the last point I have is Jesus is like light in that he beautifies our lives with his gifts and grace. We become emblems and people get to see Jesus in our lives. Now, this sermon is about Jesus. It is Christocentric, and it is what you might call a topical sermon. I would call it a topical sermon, but I also would categorize it as topically oriented. By topically oriented, I am saying again, it has equal emphasis on scripture and application to the audience.